and claimed by Spain in the 16th century and 17th century, and which Guam's current political status remains or includes numerous losses, especially the loss of cultural practices. And then Chamorro women in ancient times were empowered to make decisions about their bodies and families. In those accounts, we see clear matrilineal and matrifocal dimensions where lineage and symbolic societal power resides primarily with women. And then we will also start the bendition. Okay. Oh my gosh. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, actually, my Zoom is not letting me go ahead and share the screen. So, Bobby, are you able to just search bendition real quick? Okay, so we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves. I'm JC Chan. I'm the president of the Chamoru Club here at UP.
Hi, my name is Maya Manabusin, and I'm the vice president.
Hi, my name is Abby Payne-Dean. I'm the PRO.
Hi, my name is Brandy, and I'm the treasurer.
And then we could go ahead and start with our questions. We'll first start with Juliana Baza, who represents Famalao'an Rights. You could go ahead and introduce yourself, Juliana.
You can call me Jules, that's fine. Hi, everybody. So I'm Juliana Baza. I'm the Director of Digital Communications for Famalao'an Rights, and I'm also a UP alum, class of 2013, Mechanical Engineering. Do we want to introduce everyone first, or?
Yeah, we can go ahead and introduce everyone. Dr. Bevacqua and Vanessa, whoever wants to go first.
Sure. Half a day, everyone. My name is Vanessa Williams. I am an attorney in Guam. I am a litigator, been practicing with my own firm for the last 10 years here, and also Chamorro, born and raised in Guam.
Half a day. My name is Michael Bevacqua. I am a historian, scholar. I teach the Chamorro language. I helped found the Chamorro Studies program at the University of Guam. And I'm the co-chair for Independent Guåhan. And I have a weekly podcast called Fanatsu, which you can watch on Facebook. Sidus Masi.
Okay, we could also start with Juliana's questions first that we have created for this panel. Maya.
Yeah, hi. So our first question is, can you please introduce yourself and the movement's mission and vision? And yeah.
Thanks, Maya. So yeah, my name is Juliana. I'm Director of Digital Communications. We have 6 women who are leading this Famalao'an Rights movement, and it was created just recently. Maria Dolahan is located in New York. I'm located in Oregon, and we're all born and raised in Guam, but some of us are living in the States, and then the rest are working in Guam with us. And our mission and vision is fighting for legislation that provides accessible, affordable, and timely reproductive health care for Guam, or on Guam, for all those who want it, no matter their race, gender, or religion. And so we are starting out as an educational social media campaign. Right now we have an Instagram, a Twitter, and we have a website, and we're working on our email distribution list. But we do an Instagram Live. We've been doing Instagram Lives every Monday for Women's History Month to discuss topics such as abortion, the history, the ACLU lawsuit, just to get people talking and discussing about this issue, this women's rights issue, and why this is important for the women of Guam. So if you go to our Instagram, Famalao'an Rights, we have a link in our bio that brings you to our website where you can sign up to be a member and join our email list. And then we are trying to build that following. We want to show that we have support for this movement at a local level. So, bear with us, we're just getting off the ground, but we are so honored at all the support that has been pouring in. And then we'll be eventually wanting to file as a nonprofit as we continue to educate and fight for legislation to protect these rights. We actually would love to set up time with Miss Vanessa, the lawyer, so that, we appreciate, like I said, the outpouring of support that's happened, and it's been really fast. So we're trying to keep up with the support and the demand for this.
Awesome. Yes, Famalao'an Rights is such a great movement. It's super relative for today, especially with the ACLU case going on. And so our next question is, how can we get involved to achieve the mission of Famalao'an Rights?
It's a great question. So yeah, we're building that membership. We would love for you to follow us on Instagram, follow us on Twitter, share when we have these Instagram lives. They are recorded. We're trying to be educational. So we're trying to put stats out there, doing science-based and fact-based information about our current situation, our current stats on Guam. We pulled some public health information so we could look at, what are the actual numbers for abortion rates, what are the actual STIs by year, what do those statistics look like, and just help spread awareness about this movement, and follow us, support, and we're totally taking recommendations now for stories. We want to hear from you. What do you want to learn about? So our next Instagram live on Monday should be talking a little bit more about contraceptives and birth control and what are the options and some of the barriers to those options on Guam in particular, because there are a lot of options out there, but not all of them are available on Guam. And for whatever reason, that that's another that barrier for access for these women on Guam. So that's not right. That's something that in this day and age, we should have all the access that, to all the options, and then women can choose whatever option they want. So hopefully that helps answer the question. If you want to be a little bit more involved, please email us or message us, and you can also apply to be a member or a leadership member on that link, on that website, on the Instagram.
Our third question was, what are some unique opportunities that exist for Chamoru women today that may not have been available before?
I think opportunities like this, we're talking about it now, and it's socially acceptable more so than ever before to talk about it. Movements like this, we can get together and just start a movement like we did. This group of young women who were like, this isn't right. We should be doing something about this. Dr. Rita and Anita Areola and Governor Liu, those are some of the women that have paved the way for things like this to be possible, these movements. And then in present day, we have more access to CDC guidelines and reputable science-based organizations that discuss reproductive options and their pros and cons. So we can learn about those options and we can choose the ones that we think are best for our livelihood, and this is stuff that's talked about more openly than ever before. Like I said, we have access to it in the United States with Planned Parenthood. Nurses and doctors will talk to you about it now. I mean, if you ask, they will tell you all of your options. And I think we should really grasp that and use that. And it's so important to talk about this, to talk to your close girlfriends, to talk to your family. I know, people might be allowed to talk about this, but no more. This is something that is a health issue. You shouldn't be afraid to tell a doctor that you're sick. You shouldn't be afraid to talk about women's health with them either. And we want to make this a normality. If you feel like you want to talk about contraceptives, you should have somewhere to go. You should have, you have access on the internet. And then it's been a taboo topic on the island for so long, and it's not been the best for young girls. We have high rates of teen pregnancy and high rates of rape and sexual assault. That's not fostered a good culture on sexual health. And I think we want to change that. We want to be, fact-based, science-based. This is what's out there. This is okay to talk about, and women's health is not an issue to be hush-hush behind doors. So I think that is like the biggest opportunity we have now is, we have access to internet. We have these opportunities to get together and talk about it and educate each other and make it okay to talk about. And that's what we're doing. So hopefully that's helped. And then I think with the recent shift with the Catholic Church, they changed their stance on gay marriage, which was great. So I think that they're open to evolving with the times, and with the big influence that the Catholic Church has on the island, that brings us hope. I mean, we want the Catholic Church to be our ally in this, because for women's rights at least, and then we want them to help make it a safe, non-judgmental environment for young women. So, eventually, it's not there yet, but I see hope that we could get there one day. I really do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the last question, I know you talked a little bit about some of these, but what are some of the biggest obstacles that you believe will challenge access to reproductive health care on Guam?
I think we know some of these obstacles. So like I believe that it's the pro-life stance, the Catholic and Christian stance. Those are, those are stances that you can have personally, but those are huge influences on the island. And even in the legislature, there are senators that have openly spoken about being pro-life and that will most likely not support laws that give better access to reproductive health care for women. And that's where we get into a very controversial topic. We respect their stance to be pro-life, but pro-life stance is largely driven by faith. And we are supposed to have separation between church and state in this country. And, we're still part of the United States for now, but, even if we weren't, this is just not something that you should not force people to believe what you believe. You should be able to be, to choose whatever you would like to do with your religion and practice religion or non-religion. And, the pro-choice movement isn't about pro-abortion. It's about protecting the choice of women who may not believe the same things as the Catholic Church or the Christians or, any other religion, or, what if they're non-religious? And so it's protecting that choice, and we have to respect the choice and their choice to be religious or not religious. And that's so important. It's about, taking it out, the religious aspect out of it, out of the laws, and making all the options available so that women can choose what option they deem fit without judgment. And so that's what pro-choice is really about. It's about the choice. You can't have a choice if you restrict the options. It's like, I only want to drink Pepsi, and so I make, all the dorms only sell Pepsi, and then you have to go off campus to buy water. That's just, that's inhibiting your choice of a drink. And I know that's like a very simplified version of that, but that's not, you would be like, oh, that's not right. What if I don't like Pepsi, So that's like what we're fighting for and what we think is very, essential human right. These are great questions, ladies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Does anyone want to ask more questions? Just put them in the chat.
Yes. If you have any open-ended questions for Juliana, you can just go ahead and send it in the group chat. And then we could just wait a few minutes in case anything pops up.
25 people, this is good. Thank you. I know that this is, putting on Zoom events is, it's awesome. We're continuing on in COVID, and I think it's respectable. Thank you for doing this, Jill. Thank you for keeping up the tradition.
Yes, I wanted it to be more educational and try to keep it a little bit more fun. I know during Zoom it's kind of hard to make something more engaging, I guess, but this is a good question good event that I thought would be really helpful. Okay, so we have a question from Catalina. How can other women of color support this important work while also managing boundaries and emotional burnout?
That's a hard one because, all women of color have different barriers and obstacles that they face. And so, I would say personally, make sure that you know the boundaries of how much energy you can give. If you want to like posts and you can give us feedback on what you want to hear, but like for us and this issue for women of color, it translates, if other women of color want to learn about this is very translatable, and we can talk about that. A lot of the people in Guam are in a certain socioeconomic status, and that might be something that we can talk about, how to access reproductive health care in different socioeconomic levels. And so it can translate. And so make sure that you set personal boundaries, like how much can I actually give, and then you just do that. And it's okay no matter what you do. If you just like something, if you give feedback, if you go to a march, everything is appreciated, and every little thing is worth it, and it's going in the right direction. And you can just do something as simple as educating people that want to be educated. If you sense that they are aggressive and looking for a fight, then I would say don't do that, because that's not worth your time and energy. you know, you can educate on Instagram with stories, but if you're going to seek out or if these people are going to seek you out and they're asking for an argument, then you can just be polite and say, I respect your stance, but you don't need that. You don't need that in your life. So just be careful, you know, out there, because this is a very controversial topic. So set those personal boundaries and decide how much energy you can give, and then only give that, and it's totally okay. Hopefully that helps. Sorry, I was on mute.
Thank you so much, Juliana.
Yeah.
So if there isn't any other questions to Juliana, we can move on to Vanessa Williams, who is the local co-counsel for the ACLU case. And so our first question is, can you describe your experience fighting to restore abortion access on Guam via the legal system and being part of a coalition that is dedicated to championing Chamorro women's rights?
Sure. Well, so I can say that up until, well, prior to this lawsuit and until the last abortion provider retired from Guam in 2008, I was really more focused on women's rights in general, local women's rights in general. And I think that, well, it's just a reality that reproductive rights are part and parcel of all the other rights and choices that women make in their lives, and the issues that we face, because, you know, determining what happens with your body and when or whether you're going to start a family is just probably the most important, the most impactful thing out of everything else in your life, of the choices that you can make in your life. But in any event, so I've been proud to be part of, specifically I was a part and co-founder of the Guam Women's Chamber of Commerce back in 2013, which is really, you know, a chamber of commerce is a business league, but we were focused on advancing local women in business. And so a lot of the issues that women in business, which is essentially all working women face, come back to family issues and reproductive rights issues. So for me, those, well, again, not just for me, it's a reality, they're entangled, you know, they cannot be separated. But with respect to restoring abortion access in Guam, I didn't really focus my efforts, or, you know, my attention wasn't drawn to it until Dr. Freeman retired. I think it was sometime around July 2018, because there was still an abortion provider in Guam. And in the years prior to that, I think the numbers of abortions had been pretty consistent each year to year. So it was just not something that was specifically on my radar. But when he left and there was no provider available on Guam, I did become involved with discussions and efforts to figure out how do we restore abortion access in Guam, and looking at all the challenges women were facing in Guam seeking abortion care, whether on island or off island. And what this involved was really trying to assess what these challenges were, like why there weren't any physicians providing abortion care in Guam anymore, and why the physicians that could provide abortion care in Guam were not providing that. Looking at the specific challenges, not just, you know, taking for granted this is the stigma that's associated with it, or this is the role that the Catholic Church plays in our island, and not taking any of that for granted. Really just looking down, okay, what specifically, is it a market issue, or are there legal challenges? And so that's where I kind of came in as part of this group of individuals, is looking at what are the specific legal challenges. And there was a lot of work done decades prior to that point, where I had even become a lawyer. I've been interested in this work to lay out, okay, these are all the different laws that affect a person seeking abortion in Guam. And then looking at, okay, now let's talk to our healthcare providers and our physicians to figure out which of the, if any of these are inhibiting them, or, hearing from them. And to the extent that there was there were laws that were identified prior to this lawsuit that by myself, by others on the ground here in Guam, and by physicians, self-reported by physicians, to the extent that there were laws or legal challenges that may help, like if we could address those laws, that we could restore abortion access to Guam. I think there were efforts to have discussions with our local legislators, and our senators on what the political will was to change these. And it was kind of interesting because as this work was being done since July 2018, 2019, 2020, we had midterm elections for our senatorial candidates. And this was something that we, the Women's Chamber of Commerce even tried asking, for some of the specific laws, they're assessing these candidates' willingness to change these. And overwhelmingly, they were either non-responsive, no one wanted to address these questions, or they just said, I'm pro-life. Pro-life means I'm not willing to consider this, which I think is a whole another issue, when you talk about your responsibilities in office and what your ethical and legal duties are to look at laws, as opposed to what your personal, belief is. In any event, so it became apparent that we did have physicians who ultimately became the plaintiffs in this lawsuit, Dr. Wrighty and Dr. Bliss, who are in Hawaii, but who had treated patients from Guam in Hawaii, or had actually gotten interest from patients in Guam because they had no other access to abortion care. And Hawaii is the closest place they could go. And they contacted these physicians saying that, seeing if they could get abortions, and specifically medication abortions, because with the advances in science, now you can do, there are very effective, very safe ways to get abortion care via medication, and to do this via telemedicine, meaning everything is through video conference, your contact with the physician is remote, and you receive the medication in the mail. Unfortunately, these physicians couldn't do that because of the laws, 2 existing laws specifically in Guam that prohibit that. And it became apparent that that wasn't going to change, even as they were licensed to practice in Guam. So they're Guam licensed physicians, but they're based out of Hawaii. And these 2 laws prohibited them from providing medication abortion. So this lawsuit came about, and we just filed, it's March, so in January, after a lot of groundwork, research and then groundwork building the case for this, was by these physicians, and they're represented by the ACLU and by myself as the Guam attorney, to challenge these 2 laws and to say, that these were, for various reasons, unconstitutional, either as written or as applied, and they were violating to impose them would violate patients' privacy and liberty interests. And so that's where the lawsuit is, or that's how I became involved, and that is where we are today, or how we arrived to where we are today.
Thank you so much. Okay, and I know you touched on some of the challenges already, but can you map out the legal battle ahead?
Right, so in kind of mapping out, well, specifically for this lawsuit, this specific lawsuit, like I said, was challenging 2 laws, and those 2 laws were what I'll just call, they're 2 separate statutes in the Guam Code, and one we just call the clinic, referred to as the clinic requirement, and the other one is the in-person counseling requirement. So each of these laws is being challenged independently, but in the same lawsuit. And the clinic requirement is a 1978 law that requires that abortions be quote unquote performed in a clinic or hospital. And what the doctors are doing are challenging whether this law can be enforced or applied by the defendants, who are the Attorney General of Guam and the Guam Board of Medical Examiners, whether they can enforce this law or use this law to prevent them or restrict them from providing medication abortion via telemedicine, since prescribing medication in the mail literally is not performing a procedure in a clinic. And so they were challenging the vagueness of this law and as applied. And it's an old law, obviously, back then in 1978 wasn't intended to prohibit this, but because it's still on the books and there's no indication that there was the political will to change these or repeal this, despite, the obvious effects or implications it has today. That is why they challenged this law. So we actually reached a settlement with the defendants, the Attorney General's office and the Guam Board of Medical Examiners on this particular law, in which they essentially state that they will not use this law to prohibit licensed physicians who have a Guam license from providing telemedication abortion to patients in Guam. So half of that lawsuit has been resolved and successfully, in that now that this has opened the door for patients to be able to avail of licensed physician services for abortion care. Where we at in the legal battle now, or what is the second law? The second law remains there are challenges to the second law, which was the in-person counseling requirement. It has not been resolved. So the Attorney General's office and the Guam Board of Medical Examiners declined to reach a settlement on this particular issue. And what that second law says, the in-person counseling requirement, says that it requires that a woman be provided certain information by a designated individual within a category of different types of professionals, receive that information from that person personally in a room, and 24 hours before they actually can obtain the abortion. And the law is silent as to procedure or medication. But so now we have physicians who are able, because of this suit, who are going to be able to provide telemedication abortion, but effectively are being prohibited from advising or providing that information to their own patients that is required by the laws in Guam. So what the plaintiffs aren't challenging the fact that the information must be provided, despite the purposes and how paternalistic it might seem to be required to take this information. They're not challenging the constitutionality of that, and that patients will have to receive it 24 hours before availing of the medication abortion. What they are challenging is that they will be unable to provide this information to their patients themselves. Under this law, their patients would have to go see another person, and not a physician necessarily, just another person, a counselor, a social worker, a psychologist, maybe another doctor, and get this information from them instead, and have that person asked to answer their questions about the gestational age, embryonic development stage, and just the implications of the procedure, which, intuitively doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You want to be able to ask the physician who's going to be taking care or providing you the medication or performing a procedure. You want to ask them about the medicine that they're prescribing, but this law effectively prohibits that. So that's the law that we're challenging. And normally, you don't get relief in a lawsuit until you have a full-blown trial, so you have all these stages in the litigation process before you get to trial. But an alternative to that, or until then, you have the option at which the plaintiffs have availed of. That in this case, we filed what's called a motion for preliminary injunction, so requesting that the district court, provide, basically say, for now, you are so likely to win on your argument that this in-person requirement is unconstitutional as applied, that I'm going to find that you're right and basically allow the physicians to provide this information until we get to trial. So essentially, you're so likely to win on the merits. or the case, the opposing side's case is so weak that we're going to say that you've won for now. And we just had a hearing on that motion on Friday, and the judge took it under advisement, meaning she hasn't decided yet. The judge is Justice Kennedy out of the Northern Marianas, and she will be issuing a decision. I don't know when that will be, but if she grants our motion, then that says, okay, for purposes of this lawsuit, for now, the plaintiffs can go ahead and provide telemedicine abortion, or what if we win the motion, what that will result in is that our plaintiffs can provide this medication abortion and provide the counseling via video conference that's required by law. So they would still be meeting all the other requirements under the statute, providing the exact same information, being able to answer the questions that patients will have, doing it 24 hours before prescribing the medication. So they'll fulfill all other purposes of the statute, except they won't actually, the patients won't literally have to fly to Hawaii, or the doctors won't have to literally fly to Guam in order to give them that information face to face. So that's where we are. That's me hopefully giving as clear as I can the map of the legal battle ahead in this particular lawsuit.
Awesome. Thank you so much for even including what the abortion laws were and going into great detail about what your challenges you're going to face soon. But another question we have is like, how can you see the relationship between the ACLU and advocates in Guam evolve in the future?
Yeah. So I think that the ACLU is and in particular, the Reproductive Freedom Project, the kind of division within the ACLU that is representing in this case, they have a history with advocates on Guam going back 30 years, at least, when we had the 1990 ban, the absolute ban on abortion, and they worked with local attorney Anita Areola and other advocates on Guam in getting that ban struck down. So I think that where there is a compelling need for litigation, and there will always, I hope, I can't speak for the ACLU. I'm not a representative of the ACLU, and I'm just their co-counsel. But my hope, and what I think history shows, is that they will be there with their expertise, with their team of litigators, to challenge the laws in Guam where they are an affront on our constitutional rights, whenever that's needed. And unfortunately, you know, this is the second time that we've been in the case where we're facing an effective ban on abortions, because the only physicians who are willing to provide them are being prohibited from providing their care to their patients in Guam via telemedicine. So I think that's, in these extraordinary circumstances, that's what's prompted them to come out here. But I think that as other issues arise, which inevitably they will, and I think there are certain issues on the horizon that really are questionable, laws that as applied are not being effective or unconstitutionally depriving women of their constitutional rights, that there is the potential for, again, for partnership or resources from the ACLU to give their litigation expertise. You know, the attorneys that I work with, they just focus on reproductive rights. They are constitutional lawyers, which I am not, and I never will pretend to be. And I think it's very, on Guam, because we're so small, we don't have, I guess, enough work for attorneys to really focus in that. So I think that the ACLU will continue to work and partner with the advocates on Guam to advance civil liberties. And just as a technical matter, procedurally, as lawyers, we're not permitted to practice in states or jurisdictions where we're not licensed. And because there's no office or division of the ACLU with attorneys that are licensed here, they need local counsel to associate with. And that's why there's that partnership where it's not just the ACLU coming in representing the plaintiffs, or that way around. And I think for the local attorneys, you need expertise when you're facing big, heavy constitutional issues like that. in terms of other cases, not just litigation or lawsuit by lawsuit basis, I think there is a push for other civil rights advocates, not just on the reproductive rights front, but in general, to have the ACLU establish a more a permanent or presence or footprint over Guam, whether that be trying to get Guam within one of their other offices jurisdiction or having some small satellite office in here. I know there's interest, outside of the ACLU to bring them here like that. I don't know if there's the same interest from the ACLU, but anything's possible. But I think that because they're, if you're familiar with the ACLU's work, there's not just litigation, but they do advocacy and public education. And even the litigation is a component of that public education. But I think that because all of those things are within their mission or their objectives, that they're going to continue to support just advocacy out and public education outside of litigation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you. You touched on a lot of things that I was personally unaware of, so thank you a lot for those. And our last question for you is, what do you think are some indirect outcomes, either positive or negative, that can come out of this lawsuit?
Yeah, so the direct outcomes would be, the results that we discussed with for physicians and patients as a result of this lawsuit. Indirect outcomes I can see which are common in a lot of litigation, is you have reactions from senators or the legislature to the outcome of that litigation, and that can be positive or negative as well. Maybe
What's the Senate?
As a result of the lawsuit, or hopefully we have reasoning and are successful in our lawsuit, and it's apparent that the argument is valid and the constitutional grounds are strong, that legislators feel no choice but to move in the direction of really updating these laws to reflect the reality and ensuring that there are no unconstitutional impacts. But you will always have efforts, unfortunately, to do things to try to legislate over a court opinion in an unconstitutional manner. So even if we are successful in the lawsuit, you could see, well, you know what? No, we're going to specifically try to block telemedication abortion care to patients in Guam by enacting these other laws. And I don't, know what they could be, but you could have efforts, positive and negative efforts in legislation like that. I think the other indirect outcomes are, aside from the litigation results, is that this really brings the issue of reproductive rights and all of the issues that are kind of integrated with the lack of abortion access, like poverty and violence. They bring all of those issues to the forefront of the conversation. Like one of the biggest things I hear when I talk to people, when people ask me about this suit, or just the reasons on why this is important to me, and they hear about how we have the highest rates of sexual assault and poverty in the entire country, to the extent that we are part of the US, right? And they hear that, and they hear how the lack of abortion care exacerbates these issues, or how, and how this is integral, part and parcel of reproductive rights. They're kind of shocked. And so I think it brings all of these important women's issues they highlight that, because I think that no matter where you are, or I hope that no matter where you are on pro-life or pro-choice, on what your beliefs are on that are, we can all agree that women should not be raped, men should not be raping women or children, that, people should, that we should dismantle systems that, well, I hope people think this, but dismantle systems that keep the most impoverished and underserved in that bracket, and without even addressing abortion. Like, if we can agree on those fundamental things, those are, some of the other fundamental issues that we really have to address as a community, because they are, they are endemic to our society. Chamorros, they're disproportionately impacted by this. We can see by all of those statistics, abortion statistics, poverty statistics, and I think that it really helps to bring some of those issues, important issues, into the public discourse. So I think that is a positive outcome of this. I think it's a positive outcome that not only getting people to talk, but getting people to be more civically engaged, so taking that step further. The first step is to be educated and to get involved and be informed, be educated. And then the next step is to advocate, right? Or to be civically engaged and talk to your representatives, or, join a movement like Famalao'an Rights or any other movement or lobbying group, so that we can consolidate our power, right? And make that political will to actually affect the change that is necessary to address these issues. So I see that as, being an indirect result ultimately of the lawsuit, not just because of the lawsuit, but that's part of the, I think, just one of the benefits that come out of this lawsuit and other efforts. So I see all of that. I already see a lot of people I've already seen a lot more engagement from people who really don't think about this, people who never thought, well, I don't really think about abortion, especially, men, fathers and men in my life that were like, oh, well, I think that women should have a right to choose. But it's like, at what point do you even have a choice? If you don't have any money, if you don't have a physician, you don't have a choice. You can't get the procedure. But if you have no money to access this physician, if you don't have the vocal power, or you're not of age and you're being molested and you don't have the guardian to sign off on this is another legal issue. All those other issues, people are so unaware, we're in because we're in a privileged place to be that, myself included. A lot of these things I never thought about, because, I'm very fortunate. And so I think those are all positive outcomes, that we are identifying problems, and naturally from that, what should follow is doing something about it.
Thank you so much. Those were very powerful words. And we really appreciate you being a co-counsel for this case. We are going to start open-ended questions for Vanessa, and I actually have one already. Are you concerned that female lawmakers, this is from Patty. Are you concerned that female lawmakers who are pro-life can influence and affect the message that this is a constitutional issue and not a personal moral issue?
Okay, so the question is that perhaps pro-life senators are going to say that this is not a moral issue, that abortion access is a moral issue.
Yeah, I guess influence the message that it is a constitutional issue and not a personal moral issue. Like, how can they shift that thinking? Pro-life lawmakers, yeah, female lawmakers specifically.
Well, for one, I actually think I feel that this current state of the law is on our side, what women's rights and reproductive rights are. So if they want to shift the conversation or use that as our baseline, oh, this is not a moral issue, this is a constitutional issue, I'm perfectly comfortable with that. I think that, and that is the ground that I think we have the legal grounds, because morality and ethics and religious beliefs, those are all gray areas. There are no absolutes. It's not like the law. Well, the law is an absolute. There's a lot of gray area in the law, but I think that the state of the law as it is right now, constitutional law, that would actually be in our favor. And so if the pro-life senators want to shift it from that perspective, then I hope that we, and I feel confident about the success in our suit, and we've already been successful for the first statute, that we can hold them to account. If they say, okay, no, we're going to follow what the Constitution says, then there should not be those indirect negative outcomes that I feared, or there's going to be reactive legislation. They're going to try to legislate around it. And what the courts say, they should respect what the courts say is the final word. So I'm hoping that's the case. It's difficult. I mean, hopefully I've answered the question, Patty. I think, and in terms of if it was the other way around, if they're just going to defer to their religious beliefs and their moral ground, unfortunately, fortunately, that's why we have courts, because I can't really, argue with that. There's no room for discourse there. If there's just going to say, no, I believe, that life begins when these two at conception, and that's it. And this is murder. That's a stance. Okay, well, that's your personal belief. I cannot argue with that. That's. But this is what the law says. And, we're supposed to be founded on principles of democracy where your personal beliefs can't trump my constitutional rights.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that answer. If you have any other questions to ask Vanessa, just go ahead and send it in the chat, or you could also unmute yourself and go ahead and ask them. We'll give it a couple minutes for anything to pop up.
Hi, it's Patty again.
Hi, Patty.
Hi. This is actually for Juliana. Hi, Juliana. Hi, sweetheart. Is she still there? Well, if anyone can answer.
Patty, it's Jane. I'm WhatsApping her to tell her to get on right now. Okay.
Okay. That's her mother. She'll do what you tell her to do. If she's a good Chamorro girl, she'll do what your mother tells you. I wanted to ask the question about island culture and the conservatism that we find in the attitudes of other neighboring island cultures, where it is taboo to talk about sex and women's health, and the reluctance and resistance, to see Western doctors and talk about vaginas and periods and things like that. I've spoken to doctors who say that women come from our neighboring islands and they have breast cancer, and it is protruding from their breasts because they're so, sensitive to discussing these parts of our female anatomy. How do we reach out to not only women of these cultures, but their children and their grandchildren who may adopt and embrace the same attitudes toward sexuality and female anatomy?
Patty, I think you have to repeat the question. She's on now.
Oh, dang, that was the best question of my entire career too.
I'm sorry, I have to turn my video off, otherwise I lose audio. So
okay. So in a nutshell, I was speaking with a physician who told me that there were women that were coming from our neighboring island cultures where attitudes towards sex and women's health were very taboo. They don't talk about it. They don't discuss. In fact, he told me that there was a woman who came to him who literally had breast cancer, and it was protruding from her breast, and she could not discuss it with anyone. And so the point about getting getting a pap smear or any kind of testing on the female anatomy was so taboo. How and do we address these neighboring women, our female cultures, on their attitudes towards sex and female anatomy issues?
I heard the last part too, so thank you. This is a really good question, Patty. So that's a really tough, it's we are Micronesian, so it's part our culture too, that taboo-ness. And it's been, you know, in recent years, it's been a little bit more like, I just started when I said it's a little more socially acceptable in Guam not to talk about these things, because, you know, it's modern day and we have access to technology. So when they come over, or, you know, in the, you know, like the pie in the sky idea would be, when they come over, we have a center for them to go to, and we show them like, okay, this is technology, you know, we show them a video and say that this is okay to talk about here. This is stuff that keeps you safe. This is you know, this is stuff, this is a women's health issue, and women's health is taken very seriously here. You know, there's it's part of our culture too. Like we could even show some of them in Manamco and Guam some of these videos and say like, this is stuff that's been, you've been taught this, to not talk about it, but it's not right. And in recent years, there are more women doctors now. We can have women doctors come into the center, or, you know, maybe talk to them about, you know, I'm a doctor, I have these parts, I can talk to you about these parts, it's safe for me to do so. And it's just constant education and slowly breaking it into them. I don't imagine that it's going to be, I think we're only going to hit maybe this generation and then the ones after. I don't know that if it's going to be the previous, you know, their mothers or their grandmothers. I think that we have to start with the one now, and then if they can convince their grandmothers, then they will do so. Because I know that, you know, sometimes my grandmother will listen to my sisters because they're nurses. And so like they, you know, they've gained that reputation of, oh, she studied, she's you know, she studied in the medical field, she's respected, I can listen to her. So it's just that slow education and teaching the younger generation, and then hopefully you can infiltrate the ones behind. But it's really just moving forward. And, you know, that pie in the sky, having them come to a center, eventually I would hope that we could have a place where women could come and, you know, not be judged. There's no protesters outside, and we can talk to them about all aspects of women's health. You know, if they want to talk about contraceptives, we have resources for that. And, you know, if they have no idea what's going on, they're coming from the outer islands, we can provide resources. So eventually that's something that I'm hoping we can do with this movement. Maybe 10 years down the line, I'm not sure, but that's like pie in the sky. But yeah, we'd really just have to start with the younger ones and show them like it's okay. That's really what I would say. And in my opinion, in my experience, that does have the best impact. Like, you hit the granddaughters and they can talk to their mothers and their grandmothers. Come to this doctor, she was safe, it's okay to talk to her. And I think that's how we're going to get through to these women, is just the younger generation, the JC and Alina and Aubrey are here, and they're starting these talks, and it's good. And they're gonna proliferate this education, hopefully. So thank you for your question, Patty. Hopefully that answered some of it, but I don't have all the answers now, unfortunately. But
that was a good answer.
Okay.
That was a good answer. Thank you, Juliana.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for your questions, Patty. If there are no questions for Vanessa or Juliana, I could go ahead and move. Oh, 1 second. Okay, yeah. I could go ahead and move on to Dr. Bevacqua's. Our first question for you is, how is the battle for women's reproductive rights on Guam shaped by Guam's colonial history, past or present? Dr. Bevacqua, are you there?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Kind of. We can't see your video though.
Maybe you might have to log out and log back in.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes Zoom is finicky like that.
Yep. Okay, looks like he left, so we could just invite him back in.
Well, and maybe while Dr. Bevacqua is trying to get back in, I just wanted to add on something to all of Juliana's good points too, and how Jane was pointing out that there is an education campaign, and whose goal is to make it, destigmatize talking about the functions of the human body. I think it's also important in talking about education for youth. I mean, I think what the root causes of those shame is just the sexualization of our bodies, and I think that's part of the problem too, is that, obviously there's the reproductive functions of our systems, right? Our biological systems. But I mean, our bodies are bodies like anything else, and the cells are cells, and cancer cells can be anywhere. There's a whole host of biological problems we could face, not just resulting from sex or, pregnancy or abortion, but there's just so much shame with having breasts or vagina because they're just seen as sexual objects or tools, that I think that's where a lot of that comes from. And part of the problem is, stop objectifying women's bodies and normalizing, and using the words, the correct anatomical words for these parts, that they're not dirty words, they're not perverted words. I'm hoping that's part of the campaign, and I think that's what I feel is a problem, is we have a hard time saying that, referencing our parts, because it's like these are just supposed to be the pleasure parts for somebody else.
Yes, nicely said, and I cannot say that better. Definitely objectifying and simplifying women down to their anatomical parts is wrong, and being less taboo about sex and sexual education should be really encouraged in schools and societies, especially ones that are more religious based, especially on Guam, since the majority of Guam is Catholic. And yeah. But Dr. Bevacqua, I know you also have a presentation, but I could go ahead and ask that question one more time. How is the battle for women's reproductive rights on Guam shaped by Guam's colonial history, past or present?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I could hear you. Oh, but it might have cut out.
My is this morning for some reason.
Okay, there, I could hear you better now.
Okay. Hafide, I'm very happy to be here, and so I have so my PowerPoint addresses the 3 questions in different ways that you sent me to sort of answer. And so we'll get a little bit into the history of Chamorro women in response, and in relation to colonialism. We'll also talk about activism and sort of debate around the 1990 law, the anti-abortion law. And then finally, the question will be sort of, what about sort of Chamorro women's identity today and sort of the relationship to this history? And so, Sidus Masi to the Chamorro Club and Dr. Saturn for having me here. I'm so sorry that my internet has been cutting out. I have Docomo on Guam, which means that if it rains, the internet cuts out. As opposed to GTA, which is if somebody sneezes in your house, it cuts out. And so hopefully it won't rain here again. But so, left here we have People for Choice, which one of the groups which emerged in the 1990s around sort of supporting a women's right. Protesters outside of ACLU who continue to protest there up until this day. And so one thing we have to talk about first on this issue is the issue of cultural continuity. These are images of Chamorro women in completely different periods of time. The first one on the left is one of the earliest, it's from the 1700s, one of the earliest drawings meant to actually represent a Chamorro woman, and sort of her face, her features, and what she looked like. There was earlier representations of Chamorro women, but they weren't really meant to reflect a particular person. They were just generic drawings of Native women and Native people. In the middle, we have one of the paintings from Paul Jacques Collet, a Chamorro woman about 100 years ago. And then on the right, we have a model from Manny Crisostomo's Laddie magazine in the 1990s. And so when we're talking about cultural continuity, it means that things change, but certain important things stay the same. So all of these women are Chamorro, but they may have had very, very different views of things such as reproductive rights. They may have very different places in relation to their culture at the time. The governments at the time may have treated them very differently. And so we should remember that, because when people make statements about what Chamorro culture is or what Chamorros are, you have to remember that they may have been very different just 100 years ago. And so if we think, for example, that the older generation is more conservative about these issues, if you go back 200 years before that, Chamorro women probably would have been much more progressive about issues of reproductive rights than they are today. And so we have to remember that when talking about these sorts of things, because people will invoke culture. This is the culture, this is the value, this is the way it is. But all of those things change with time, with people, with circumstances, with events that happen, and so on. But if we go back to ancient times, one thing that's very clear is that across Micronesia, there are matrilineal features of all cultures, but Chamorros were most likely the one in which women were the most generally empowered. And the early missionaries, such as Salvatore, sort of made clear that it wasn't just that you had your lineage from your mother, but actually that in public, your mother had more power potentially than your father did. Your mother and her sisters and her female cousins dictated the land. One of the things that offended the priests so much was that men were punished for infidelity, whereas women were allowed. And that men were not men.
Sorry, Dr. Bevacqua, you're cutting out.
It is not Chamorro culture was a matriarchy.
Oh, never mind. It's back.
Oh, sorry. It is not that Chamorro culture was a matriarchy where women dominated men, but it was much more equal in terms of the balance of the relationship between men and women. So we know about the Magahaga, that the Magahaga was a thing. Spanish talk about it. They talk about women having power, but they didn't like to go into detail about sort of the role of women specifically in life in terms of having political power. One of the few passages in which a priest, Salvatore himself, acknowledges it is that he does acknowledge that that in Sidza, which today is this area, Sela Bay in southern Guam, that the people in the village were ruled over by a woman, that the woman commanded the men in the village. And one reason why the Spanish identify her and single her out is because she was on their side. She was somebody who was devoted to Christianity, and she organized the men in her Chamorros who were to the Spanish. Were all the history book existing the Spanish, women were likely more resistant, because more to lose. With new religion, with their new way of life, they were pretty much proposing that women lose power in just about every place which they enjoyed it, including while they would be in the home.
Sorry, Dr. Bevacqua, you're cutting out again.
Were much more resistant. But space in which they would have some power.
I guess he'll come back, but in the meantime, we'll just wait for him.
It was a good presentation so far.
Hey, dispensative. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Can you
we
hear
can
me?
hear you.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what to do. Perhaps Docomo is anti-choice. I don't know. All right. So as we get into the Spanish era, Chamorro women seek to retain and regain and sort of seek to retain, but also attain new power however they can. So Chamorro women were part of religious ceremonies prior to the Spanish coming in. But once the church comes in, they're suddenly shut out. You can kneel and you can pray, but you don't have any actual authority. There's no formal role for a woman in the church except to sort of clean up after the priest and prepare and help the priest. So we see the Tetsa emerge at that time, where Chamorro women insist on sort of taking a role, and it is not a church position, it is a community position. Although in the centuries since, the church has tried to sort of legitimize its control over the Tetsa is Chamorro women insisting that if this is going to be the center of our life now, this new religion, then we have to have a place in it. What we see happen is that the Spanish set up this, and Chamorro women still sort of have control. So much more women will still contribute to finances for most families. Is that family would dictate the finances. And when the Americans come in, the are actually
Sorry, there are so many technical difficulties, but he'll probably come back in again.
all right. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, all right. I gave up on my house Wi-Fi. I'm trying my Wi-Fi from my phone. Right, the American period. What happens under the American period is interesting because different condemn Chamorros for being medieval in their treatment of women, but they also don't like that Chamorro women are empowered. They don't like that Chamorro men give their wages to the women to control, which is why one Navy governor decides to declare officially that Guam is a patriarchy, that men are in charge of the families, that Chamorro women and their power on Guam is offensive, uncivilized, all sorts of stuff like that. And so, but one thing that happens under the United States, though, is that by this time, Chamorro women retain some of that social power, but largely have sort of much of society is about sort of policing their bodies and keeping them from fooling around, keeping them from shaming the family. And so what's different under the United States, though, is that suddenly there's new job opportunities for Chamorro women. Under the Spanish, there is not a lot, but under the Americans, there's a need for nurses. And also there's opportunities for teachers. And so we see more and more Chamorro women jumping into these fields in order to make their own money, in order to sort of, set their own path in life. But initially we see Chamorro families at that time resistant to this, actually arguing that sort of against women being able to become nurses. So many Chamorro families at that time wouldn't allow their daughters to become nurses because they were afraid that they would be out alone walking. And there was a phrase at that time called Palawan Salin, which some people still use today, and it means a woman of the road. And you use it to refer to a woman who is by herself unchaperoned. And it's like calling her a very negative name. And so the women who had these jobs walked alone, sometimes unchaperoned. And so this is where we see Chamorro women used to having, feeling like there is this power that they're supposed to have, but the society, and including Chamorro culture at that time, seeking to kind of strip them of it. And this is this delicate sort of this delicate balance between a dance by Netnon Gefpalgo, they call it the silhouette dance. And so it tells the story of one woman who was sexually assaulted by a Japanese soldier. But they perform the dance behind a silhouette. And other women dance and sort of help the woman up afterwards. And it's a very empowering and very, very sort of traumatic dance. But so Chamorro women at this time struggle to sort of escape this violence. And so there's many stories about cutting, families cutting off the hair of women, of dressing them up like boys. In fact, some families, they will cover, they would rub mud on the faces of women to make them less attractive. And some went so far as actually to smooth or keep it in the pockets of women in order to try to prevent the Japanese from assaulting them. And so, but one thing that we've seen though, is that despite a lot of these sort of colonial barriers, women sort of empowering figures, we have Beatrice Emsley on the left, a survivor of a along with other Chamorros in Hagåtña in the closing days. Agigi Rape Office after World War II. Clotilde Gould, a songwriter. Lujan Guerrero, the Magahagan Guåhan, who sort of is the first female elected governor on the island of Guam. And so one thing that's interesting is that one way in which we could see this Magahaga sort of strain in life, even as women were contending with a lot of patriarchal sort of restrictions, is that Guam was already setting records in the Pacific and in much of the world for female elected leadership, even prior to Lu being elected into office. So in the early 90s, Guam had the highest representation of female elected leadership in the legislature in the Pacific and in most of the world, with 1/3 of the senators being women. And then more recently, Guam set another record in which it had a supermajority of women in the Guam legislature. And so there has been persisting this sort of this strain of female empowerment amongst Chamorro women, even as much of society has sort of sought to restrain it. And so let's move into the 1990s, the abortion struggle in the 1990s. And so here you can see a sort of a newspaper article from that time, and you can see differing rallies anti-choice, pro-choice, sort of on the same page of the PDN. And so prior to 1990, so after Roe v. Wade was decided in the United States, this woman right here, Concepcion Barrett, she was the only senator who was a woman in the 13th Guam legislature. And she, after Roe v. Wade was passed, she took it upon herself in order to basically make it so that abortions could become legal on Guam. When she did this, there was no public opposition, but there was also no public support necessarily. She did it very quietly to sort of get it through, hoping that sort of women would have these options available to them if they wanted them. In the next decade, however, what happens is that there's another case in the United States, Webster versus Reproductive Health Services, which basically opens the door for states to now try to restrain Roe versus Wade and add in all sorts of barriers and all sorts of obstacles to get so that women to get these types of reproductive health services. And one person in Guam who responds to this as states around the United States start to create laws to make it harder and harder to get these services is the woman sitting on the right on the couch there, the late Senator Elizabeth Areola. And so in conversation with the Catholic Church at that time, and hearing the news about what is going on in the States, she decides that Guam should update its abortion law and that it should follow a lot of these trends to make it much more restrictive. Now she's sitting next to her daughter, Anita Areola, who is an attorney, who of course has been mentioned in the presentations previously and we'll talk about later in this presentation. And so Bill 848 was drafted by Bill Areola, and it was one of the most restrictive bans on abortion in the United States at that time. It was so restrictive, there was no exceptions for rape or incest. And in fact, it was only if an abortion posed a serious health risk to a woman could she get it. And there had to be approval from a medical review panel in order to get that. And one thing which made it very controversial was there was a solicitation clause, which meant that counseling or referring people for reproductive health services was criminalized. And so here we have People for Choice was a group that formed around that time, and this was a flyer which was handed out to try to get the message out to people about what this bill might represent, the danger it might represent to women and their rights on Guam. Governor Ada, at that time, he signed 848. It became Public Law 2134. In signing it, though, he said that he invoked Chamorro sacrifices in World War II and Vietnam. He said that our people are willing to die for freedom of the United States, but why can't we dedicate ourselves, as he said, to helping unborn children? He said that he wasn't doing it to make any statement about what was going on in the States, that it was a community issue, a community concern. That was his argument for it. But it did become a national concern. Guam appears in newspaper editorials. There's coverage all over the United States. Guam's grotesque muddle. Guam once, as one columnist wrote, once an outpost of American democracy, Guam is now, it's supposed to be now, not. Guam is now leading the assault on the civil liberties of US citizens. The ACLU gets involved in this and sends the woman in the middle there, Janet Benshuf, to Guam, where she gives a speech in which she talks about how after this law is passed, now that this law is passed, you can go to Hawaii if you need reproductive health services. And she's promptly arrested under the newly passed law, under the newly signed law. And so she had called this, what was happening in Guam, the Pearl Harbor for women's rights, basically referring to it as a huge moment, like an attack. No one expected that Guam would be the place where the attack on women's rights would come from. And so she invoked that in order to try to to stir up controversy and interest around this. Now, eventually this law was struck down. The government of Guam tried to defend it, but it was struck down because it was definitely inorganic, it was definitely unconstitutional. And so one reason why I am talking about this, one reason why this interests me, is because this is a very personal thing for me. I am not a woman. I do not face a lot of these issues, but this history is part of my history. And so if you'll see the woman here holding the Guam flag, she's standing next to Jane Fonda, interestingly enough, and that's my mom, Rita Lujan Butler. And so she was the head of the Guam Nurses Association at this time, along, and also current Magahaga Lou Leon Guerrero was also a president and of the Guam Nurses Association at this time. And they organized nurses, they rallied, they did all sorts of things to try to organize the community to challenge this law, this anti-abortion law. And so these images are from when they had a huge sort of women's rights rally in Washington, DC. And so my mother and some other nurses from Guam went. One of them gave a speech in front of the crowd about the issues in Guam. And so when people ask me why I became an activist, one of the reasons that I give is because of my mom's example. Because when I was young, you know, one of the first rallies or protests that I went to was with my grandmother, my younger brother, and my mom, sort of going around Paseo for a candlelight vigil, you know, to protect women's rights. And in fact, the first time that I've ever heard a death threat was at that time too. Because sometimes people would call my grandparents' house and they would say horrible things about my mom and they would threaten her. And so once I picked up the phone when somebody called and I got to hear the horrible things that they said about my mother before my grandmother took the phone from me. And so for me, this is a very personal, real thing. And I think my mom is also in the Zoom room, or at least her iPad is. Nope. Oh, she left. Stamapus. Oh my goodness. She was here earlier. Maybe she has Docomo internet service too, even though she's in the States. Now, let's talk about what this means though in terms of identity and culture. So one of the things choice stance at that time tended to do so in a very American context. The feeling was that those who were anti-choice were the Chamorro side, because they talked about Chamorro culture. They talked about motherhood. The church was very much a part of that. And so those who argued in favor of sort of women's rights and were pro-choice, they tended to take positions that this is about being an American, you know, and it set up this dynamic where if you were Chamorro, you were supposed to be anti-choice, but if you were pro-choice, it meant you were an American. And so we saw that, and some of that also came about because many of the loudest voices on island who were protesting this were white women from the States. Filipinos and Filipino women tended to be very anti-choice. According to polls, women were evenly split, despite any claims that Chamorro women were anti-choice or in favor of this law. The polls shown at that time actually said that Chamorro women were split in terms of how they felt about whether this was a good law or whether abortion should be legal in Guam or not. And so Senator Areola, you know, she made lots of statements about how, you know, this is an issue of our community as a people, we should have the right to decide what is cultural, what is moral, you know, and she said, if we're talking about indigenous rights, how can we not talk about the rights of the unborn? And so I bring this up though, because I don't think that we have to accept this idea that, so this is this is something which unfortunately comes about in colonial situations, is that when a colonizer comes in, they tell you that progress lies through them. They tend to denigrate your culture. They tend to tell you that whatever you believe in isn't true, it's not important, you need to give it up, you need to sort of do whatever we do. And so the idea of change and progress and evolution, it becomes associated with the colonizer, right? And so for me, that's always a problem, because I don't think that in order to protect women's rights, it has to be this American thing. I think that it is a very Chamorro thing. But I always think that we can always make the case that this is the law of the United States, but we also need to think, what is our culture? What is the community? So more recently, Chamorro culture has become associated with Catholicism, and in some ways is very conservative. But if you go further back, Chamorro women would have been completely empowered in ancient times to make these choices about their reproductive health. And that likely if men intervened in these sorts of things, men would have been shut down. And so when we're talking about culture, we shouldn't abandon sort of the debate, because this is the way America is. Because if you do that, you change the law, but you don't actually change the values. You don't actually change what people feel. You don't actually change our sense of community. And so for me, whenever somebody says that the Chamorro way is this way, I always argue, no, I don't think that. I think that if we go into our roots as a culture, Chamorro, I think that if we had this debate before colonization, it would be clear. And I think that when we're talking about Chamorro empowerment today, it is not an issue in which we are becoming more Americanized. It's an issue in which we are becoming more indigenized, in which we are returning to something that was taken from us, something that was disrupted for hundreds of years. And if we focus it in that way, then it's not about losing our culture, or that I have to choose, am I going to embrace my culture, or am I going to be a modern person? But instead we find that sort of we can progress with our culture, that we can have these debates, and that we can come to a place which reflects who we are and what is important to us. And so, Sidus Masi, I am so sorry for all of my internet problems, which may feared with the presentation and whether you could hear me or not. And so I don't know if there's any questions. I know that I probably went a little bit long.
That was excellent, sir. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Sidus Masi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bevacqua. I'm just gonna leave it open for some questions maybe in the chat, if anyone has.
Yes, if anyone does, because this is something what I was mentioning at the end is something we've seen. So for example, when Chamorro women first started wanting to work and basically have their own income and jobs in the early 20th century, a lot of Chamorros felt that they were becoming Americanized, that they were losing their culture. But it's like, no, that's only if you think that that Chamorro culture is that women are in this place. But if we think that Chamorro women are strong, Chamorro women are important, Chamorro women should be empowered, then, and you take a longer view, then you can see that they were simply trying to regain something. There was something in them, this Magahaga sort of energy, this power, which has been there even as colonizers of many different faces, and even internal colonizers have sought to suppress it. And so, but if we say that they were doing this because they wanted to Americanize and modernize and they were leaving their culture behind, all we do is actually hurt ourselves. Because we end up, because your colonizer tells you your culture is useless and empty. And we can do that to ourselves if we accept that and say, oh yeah, well, in order to be successful, I have to give all these things up. In order to be, like live in the world today, I have to give these things up. So that's why it's difficult. And the 1990s debate showed it. for a lot of the women, such as, such as my mother, Anita Areola, Lujan Guerrero, the community it was so difficult to talk about these things that you couldn't really make a strong argument as a Chamorro, because so many people had it in their head that no, Chamorros are about family, family means this, and so this is bad, this is not who we are. But now that things have, as the other two panelists have mentioned, now that things are more open in terms of what a woman should be, what a woman could be, what Chamorro, what Chamorro culture can be, who the Chamorro people can be, then we find that it's easier now. And so in terms of our peoplehood, we always got to remember that if there's an issue that is important to us and it's important to the people we love, then we should never say that, we should never abandon a Chamorro position on it. We should understand from our culture, from our place in the world, from our history, what does this mean? And sometimes it'll create these difficult conversations, right? Where, your grandmother may be stuck or your grandfather may be stuck having a certain view of it, right? But that's why I think, and somebody was mentioning it, somebody was mentioning it in the comments. One thing that colonization has done to the Chamorro people is that it has really suppressed. Like if we remember some of our grandparents, some of our great grandparents, in many ways they could be lively, they could be jovial, but on certain things they wouldn't talk, they wouldn't express, they would have trouble communicating. And so that's why one of the things that's really nice about the Chamorro cultural renaissance is just that Chamorros are free. They're more free to express. They're more free, to talk about these issues. If you're, and in the past, there wasn't a place for that. For a lot of people, there wasn't a place. And so that bodes well for our culture, because if you think that your grandmother may have one position on this and it may be against your position, right? But there's ways that you could probably expand your grandma's sense of the world, right? Because there's ways that you could sort of open it up a little bit more so that the Chamorro doesn't have to be this tiny thing which fits right under the Catholic Church, right? It doesn't have to be this tiny thing which just fits right there. It can be much bigger. We can be more open to things. And if we take that position and if we help people understand that position, it's easier. It's a little bit easier. Yeah, because this is, and so for me, this is why, as I spoke to Vanessa, who spoke earlier, because I made a declaration for the recent lawsuit by the ACLU, and for me, I said that personally, I don't like relying on the US Constitution to make our claims about ourselves. So I don't, but legally I understand that in Guam, it's the best argument to make. It's good. But for me, it's kind of like, if we push for these issues and we get what we want, but it happens because the colonizer passes a law or makes a decision, but we as a community don't change. For me, that's a problem, because it was just a few generations ago that the US Navy decided to ban Chamorro language in schools and in public spaces. And so I don't like it when the United States is able to determine things in Guam without us having a say. And sometimes they determine things in ways that I like. Sometimes they determine things in ways that I don't like. But I don't like it that either way, it's just a coin flip. Whether what happens reflects what I feel about our community or what I feel our values are, right? And so that's why, yeah, for me, but I ultimately agreed to help to help with the lawsuit, just because I felt that, as I said in my presentation, that Chamorro women long ago, prior to colonization, would have been completely empowered. That's my feeling, my interpretation. is that they would have been empowered. Colonization has given us a lot of crap, and some of that crap, most of that crap mainly falls on Famalao'an, on Chamorro women. And so if for now we can get it to a point where Chamorro women have more of that everyday control, have access, are less disempowered, then let's go for it, even if it means relying on sort of these US constitutional legal arguments. Oh, wow. Oh, I see some questions. Okay. And so I think, one of the things which will be very helpful in terms of bridging the gap is some people who are very strong in their Catholicism, right? As I said, their sense of Chamorro culture is very limited. Those are the people, for example, who don't feel like Tautau'tano dancing should be in the church. Those are the people who, because their sense of what the Chamorro is so small, and it's so strictly defined by religion that they don't see. And it's interesting because for many years, cultural dancers were not allowed into the church, even though families, when somebody had died, they would request, I want a dance group to come and do a chant, and the church would never allow it because they said no. And what was interesting though is that was a Chamorro who was in charge of that, the former Archbishop Tony Apron. He was always against that, keeping a strict line that these cultural things over here from ancient stuff, that's against Chamorro Catholicism. What happened when the new Archbishop Byrne came in is that when he came in, he reached out to Tautau'tano, and he actually said, "Can you please perform a blessing for me when I come into the church?" Now, he's also Catholic, but his sense of Catholicism isn't that a Chamorro has to choose whether they respect their ancient ancestors or whether they are strongly Catholic today. But for a lot of older Chamorros, that's their sense, right? Is that if we go into those things, that's the devil, that's evil, that's bad, that's Tautomotna stuff. But for Byrne, it was interesting because when he came in and he talked to some of the dancers, they were like, "We're so thankful that, because most of the dancers are Catholic, we don't understand why the church won't let us." And he said, around the world, the church opens its doors to indigenous people. That if you are coming into a place with lots of indigenous people in Mexico, the church may bring in indigenous people to bless you. And so that's part of that expansion, is that Catholicism doesn't have to be against these sorts of things. Some people may draw their political lines that it is, and some people may feel here that it is, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And so I always think that that's something that was for me like an important example in terms of expanding, opening it up, that opening that up about what Catholicism inhibits or constricts in Chamorro culture, and does it need to, right? Like Chamorros at the start of the 20th century would say that Magellan, if not for Magellan, we would not be Christians. But now, if you have a better sense of history and these sorts of things, more of us understand today that you didn't need to be colonized to become modern. You didn't need to have so much taken away from you in order to progress. And so, but for the older generations, that was their assumption, is that if we didn't lose everything, we wouldn't have anything. If they didn't take it all, if they didn't do this, we would still be naked running around in the jungle. But it's like, no, well, now it's kind of okay to run around, and you got your sadi, your loincloth on, and you got your leaf, you got your sort of outfit, your regalia like that. And so that's part of the opening up of what Chamorro is. The colonizer put us in this, and slowly we work to open it up. And you can't reach everybody, but every generation changes a little bit. I mentioned earlier Chamorros being like closed off. The late Paul Berdaliu, who was such a radical, he was such a radical in so many ways. He pushed for the Chamorro Land Trust to be passed. He pushed for Chamorro language to be taught in schools. He fought the Navy when they wanted to turn Sela Bay into an ammunition wharf. So many things. And an anecdote about him, about 20 years ago, is that he was watching some of these dances that, like the Pa'atautotano style dancing, the style of dancing that BJ Terlaki, who did the Bendishon at the beginning, does. And he was brought to tears, and people around him were saying, oh, but it's not real. This is not how Chamorros dance. To dance, to express, to be strong. For him, it wasn't, it didn't matter if Chamorros danced like this 1,000 years ago. What mattered was that it represented Chamorros feeling open and free and excited about their identity. It was that you didn't have to look at your ancient ancestors and be glad that you got colonized, or else you'd be sitting in a hut, right? But that it meant that Chamorros had an open connection to their resources, to their language, to their past. And so what moved him to tears was the freedom of the youth, that the youth will feel more open about their future, whereas his generation had felt like the future wasn't theirs. The future belonged to others. But part of the cultural change was that nowadays we feel more open to things that our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and going on back felt that they couldn't question, that they couldn't, you couldn't do anything about it. It was just the way it is. So that's, but yes, so let me bridge the elder female values into the, it is, yeah, it is hard. It is hard. And and I am not a woman, so it's, in some ways, I shouldn't even necessarily speak out about sort of these conversations. I can speak in a very general way about it. But I have a lot of privilege as a light-skinned, half Chamorro with an Italian last name too. And so, but I think that there's ways to do it, because there are these strong barriers. There are these super strong barriers, but I found that there's ways you can get around them with the older generation. But yeah, in terms of speaking to older Chamorro women in a female context like that, I can talk about it in the language context, because that's where sort of because I've tried to help a lot of young Chamorros whose grandparents won't speak to them in Chamorro. And because they say that the language is useless, the language is going to die out, the real language is already lost, they put up all of these sort of barriers and they make all these excuses to take sort of this position. But one thing that I've always told my students is that if you can get them past that barrier, you are giving them a gift. If you can get them to teach you and speak Chamorro to you, then it's a gift for you, but you will give them a peace and a joy that has been taken from them, because they were punished for speaking Chamorro when they were young. There was all this pressure around them that told them that the language is useless, don't use it, give it up. And so they internalized a lot of that. And so when you ask them to speak to you, it's not that they actually hate Chamorro, because they use Chamorro all the time. They can speak it fluently. It's part of who they are. But it's because there's all this pain that they haven't dealt with. They haven't talked about. They don't know how to get past. And so I always tell young people, if you push them, if you find any way to break that down, you will find that they will never want to stop speaking Chamorro to you. And that is a joy that I have seen with so many different families, where they get past that. And then the grandparents are eager to speak Chamorro, because something that has always been part of them, that they were told and they were made to believe is useless, finally they realize it's important. the language of my parents, the language that filled my life when I was young. It's beautiful, it's important. I love it. And now I can share my love. I don't have to listen to all of the voices and the spanking and the slapping teachers, you know? Now I can be who I am. And so I think there may be some similarities in that with how you could approach sort of talking to older Chamorro women, because about these sorts of issues, because they have that same thing in them. They have this strength, they have this power, but I also see that there's all these ways in which they have been told that they're not supposed to have that, or it is supposed to be minimized and it's supposed to be constrained, right? But yes, so some things to think about. Oh yes, yes, definitely. Oh yes, men absolutely have a crucial role, absolutely. Oh yes, but I just don't want to, I just didn't want to sort of, you know, take up too much space in terms of telling women how they should talk to their moms or their grandmothers. I don't think that's appropriate. But yes, Sidus Masi for giving me the chance to talk. Man, I wish my mom was here. I was totally gonna embarrass her.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bevacqua. It's very empowering, everything you said. So we're coming around the end of our Zoom meeting. I would just like to thank Dr. Bevacqua, Attorney Williams, and Juliana Baza. We're so glad that we are able to create this space and talk about and educate others on women's reproductive rights, especially in the Marianas. Your insights, your background, and passion for growing and supporting this narrative is super empowering. And we're extremely grateful for your participation and time and efforts to continue this work. And also thank you to everyone who has joined us in this conversation today. I hope you were able to get something out of it, learn something, spread the word, educate others. And I think at the top of our chat is also the Famalao'an Rights Instagram and website for you to go ahead and spread that word to support this cause. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having
Sidus Masi.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to have you all.
Thank you for coordinating this, and thank you everyone for for showing up.
Can I just add something since I have you all on, if you don't mind?